Let's talk about the way the war ended. And really, in the United States, the country's being torn into supporters of the war and opponents of the war. Supporters of the war were of all ages, and they wanted to increase the war effort, put more money and resources into Vietnam to win it. And opponents thought the war was really unimportant. Vietnam was unimportant to us. Didn't think it could be won easily, and thought it was morally wrong. Um, in 65 through 68, when Lyndon Johnson was president, those 3 years, he began escalation and expansion of the war, and he began to send more troops there. The Viet Cong, who were the insurgents in the South, the ones who were fighting the Americans in the South, their presence in the South was growing, being helped from the North. And they were being helped mostly by a series of camps and replenishing and refueling stations along what is known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through it went into Vietnam as well, but it also went in Laos and Cambodia. So a lot of the trail, a lot of the resupplying was outside of Vietnam and outside the reach of the United States. 65, the number of soldiers in Vietnam jumped from 25,000 to 184,000. A huge leap of sources, resources, and manpower. And there were no signs we were winning the war. This was early on, though. And we didn't want to conquer the North. Just like Korea, we wanted to get the North to leave the South alone. Stop the enemy from fighting. Here are the political divisions in the U.S. There are these divisions today. There were hawks who supported the war and doves who opposed the war. Hawks led by Lyndon Johnson and conservatives, and doves led by people like just some politicians, but big voices like Martin Luther King Jr. who came to oppose the war. Then something called the Tet Offensive happened, and that changed a lot of people's opinion about the war. This was in 1968. We had 536,000 soldiers in Vietnam serving. It's called the Tet Offensive because Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. Usually there was on holidays like that, fighting stopped, so no one is expecting anything to happen on the Vietnamese New Year. But on that day in 1968, 30 different targets were hit by the Viet Cong all over South Vietnam. And this meant a couple things to the United States. It meant that, they didn't win any of these battles, but it meant that they could have a large-scale campaign, even though they suffered heavy losses and lost almost all these battles. But it also meant that they were communicating very well all across Vietnam to coordinate this attack on 30 different targets. And it discouraged a lot of Americans. A lot of Americans who were for the war after the Tet Offensive thought, well, this is out of control. We can't win this thing. And then some Americans said, well, to win it, we need more money. We need more military in there. Those people thought that the military had not been given the proper resources and had not been given a fair opportunity to win this war. The truth about the North Vietnamese and the communists from North Vietnam was that it was a brutal regime. The intelligentsia, as the communists would call it, the college-educated workforce, the philosophers, the teachers, the people who challenged doctrine, they were killed. Doctors, teachers, writers, reporters. The killing fields of Vietnam are well known. And at a village called Hue, no, it's not a village, it's a town called Hue, they killed about 4,000 civilians who did not support the regime. And America was not, they were not without blame for killing of civilians. The most famous of those is the My Lai massacre. This was where Americans, confused and frustrated in a village, began to line up civilians that they thought were Viet Cong, and then they also lined up the villagers they thought were protecting the Viet Cong, women, children, everybody, and began to shoot them all. 400 civilians were killed at My Lai, supposedly by American troops. And even though it was a bloody and terrible tragedy, one American helicopter pilot landed between the soldiers and the civilians to stop the massacre. So there was at least one hero in that instance, an American. Students in the United States, well, there were lots of students because this was when the baby boomers, the children that were born after World War II, who were just coming into college years. So there was an all-time high enrollment in colleges, and these baby boomers began to question authority. They were reflective, and they began to protest the war. They were the ones who pushed for civil rights. And this generation gap between the World War II era parents and the baby boomers began to widen during the Vietnam War because this was an issue that divided families. The people who were part of the New Left who opposed the war were usually younger, and it was a new political movement, really fueled by the counterculture, which was hippies and music and even drugs and stuff like that. And these people thought that radical change was needed to tackle problems like not just Vietnam, but problems like poverty in this country, and homelessness and hunger and racism. And these young Americans began to resist the draft. Males between the ages of 18 and 25 were drafted for the Vietnam War. They were drafted during Korea. They were also drafted during World War II. But as this war became more and more unpopular, more and more people began to oppose the draft. There was such a thing as a conscientious objector who could get a pass but they had to prove that it wasn't just because they didn't want to fight. It was because usually their religion prohibited them from fighting. Some people who wanted to serve their country and were Mormons or something like that could join the armed forces. They couldn't fight, though, but they could work in the offices or supplies. You can get a deferment for postponing military service if you were injured, if you were the only male member of your family, if you're married, if you're a full-time student with good grades. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson twice, not once, but twice doubled the number of men to be drafted in that year. And that was the year that this resistance to the draft began to explode. People burned their draft cards. People refused to show up. Some people left the United States and went to Mexico or Canada where they couldn't get drafted. Some people claimed injuries. Some people claimed mental illness. People did all kinds of things to get out of the draft back then. Protests by 1968, there were 200 protests all across the country. The center of protests for Indiana were college campuses, the largest of which were down at IU, where student protesters actually burned the ROTC building down at IU and also marched down onto the main square and smashed all the windows. Lyndon Johnson decided in 1968 not to run for re-election. He had become president because of the death of John F. Kennedy. He decided not to run for re-election. Secretary of Defense, the guy who created the plan to fight in Vietnam, Robert McNamara, lost faith in the war and didn't think we could win it. He urged the president to get out of Vietnam and leave the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves. A majority of Americans were ready to pull out of Vietnam. In place of the number one runner for the presidency from the Democratic Party was JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy. And as he was running for president, he was an anti-war. He wanted to pull the troops out of Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson was afraid of the Kennedys, and he decided in 1968, now that Kennedy was running, since he was unpopular, the war was unpopular, that he would not run for president. And let's leave it right there. And we'll talk about the end of the war in the next lecture.